Imagine being born into luxury beyond imagination, yet trapped in a gilded cage, where every choice is dictated by duty, not desire. Across centuries, royal courts hid a harsh reality behind velvet curtains and glittering crowns, the relentless practice of marrying children and adolescents. Young princes and princesses were stripped of childhoods, their fates sealed by alliances and dynastic ambition. While history glorifies royal opulence, it conceals the sorrow of those forced into unions before they could understand love, intimacy, or even consent. This is the untold story of youth sacrificed for power. If history's hidden cruelties fascinate you, stay with this story. Comment your thoughts, share it, and subscribe to uncover more secrets of royal life, where crowns gleamed on young heads, yet freedom and innocence were stolen long before they could claim them. Throughout history, royal families across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East arranged marriages that prioritized political advantage over personal choice. Every coronation, treaty, or territorial claim often depended on the careful orchestration of these unions. Age mattered little. A girl of 9 could be pledged to a prince of 12, or a boy of 13 could be bound to a young heiress. These marriages were legal, socially sanctioned, and seen as essential for the survival and dominance of dynasties. In 11th century Europe, child marriages among royalty were institutionalized. Monarchs viewed them as tools to secure alliances, peace treaties, or territorial expansion. Chronicles recorded ages clinically, as if noting numbers on a ledger, neglecting the child's humanity. Princesses were often valued as pawns to strengthen dynastic ties, while boys were groomed to produce heirs. Childhood was a fleeting luxury, replaced by education in etiquette, politics, and religion. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, was betrothed at age 8 to Louis VII of France. Although she later became a formidable queen, her early years were shaped by political expectation, not personal growth. Similarly, in the Byzantine Empire, young princesses were often promised to foreign rulers in infancy to cement alliances. These early commitments carried lifelong consequences. Marriage could be immediate or delayed until puberty, yet the psychological burden of knowing one's fate was predetermined was inescapable. In Asia, imperial children faced comparable pressures. Chinese dynastic families arranged marriages for political consolidation. Elaborate rituals might celebrate these unions, yet children were sent to distant courts, expected to perform ceremonial roles beyond their comprehension. Even when consummation was postponed until adolescence, the awareness of being a political tool left deep emotional scars. Royal children had to balance the expectations of loyalty, obedience, and maturity while navigating fear and isolation. Child brides faced severe physical risks. Early pregnancies were dangerous in a time with rudimentary medicine, and mortality rates among adolescent mothers were high. Nevertheless, producing heirs was non-negotiable. Emotional deprivation, social isolation, and chronic stress were widespread but rarely recorded. Royalty created a world where childhood was systematically eroded, replaced by the obligations of duty and legacy. Legal systems varied, but in medieval Europe, marriages of 12 or 13 were recognized, granting full control over children's lives to families and state. Even when regions imposed minimum ages for marriage, exceptions for royalty were nearly universal. Children's consent was irrelevant, overshadowed by law, tradition, and political expediency. They became instruments of dynastic strategy, stripped of agency. The political implications were significant. Dynasties used marriages to stabilize empires, secure borders, and prevent succession disputes. Yet the human cost, emotional repression, lost childhoods, premature pregnancies, and death was immense. Royals internalized the value of lineage over personal happiness, perpetuating cycles where youth was subordinated to ambition. Historical records illustrate diverse experiences. Some children lived in distant courts, separated from family, forming superficial bonds with spouses. Others cohabited immediately, facing responsibilities far beyond their years. Education centered on etiquette, religion, and political literacy, leaving no space for play, creativity, or personal exploration. Letters and memoirs hint at sorrow and rebellion, though such accounts were often suppressed. In medieval England, girls like Mary Tudor were betrothed in early adolescence to secure international alliances, highlighting the use of child marriage as a tool of diplomacy. Similarly, in India, Rajput princesses were promised in childhood, navigating the duality of honor and subjugation within rigid hierarchical structures. In Africa, certain royal families also arranged early unions to strengthen tribal or territorial bonds, emphasizing that the practice was global. The psychological impact of these marriages was profound. Adolescents forced into intimate relationships without emotional readiness experienced fear, confusion, and trauma. Royal life, though outwardly majestic, imposed strict hierarchies and expectations, leaving little space for autonomy. Children were expected to master adult responsibilities, often before understanding their own desires or boundaries. Medical risks compounded the dangers. Young bodies subjected to early pregnancies and childbirth endured severe strain. Combined with limited nutrition and primitive healthcare, mortality rates for adolescent brides were alarmingly high. Historical accounts reveal not just political maneuvering, but repeated cycles of physical and emotional suffering endured in the name of dynasty and alliance. Gender played a central role. Girls were primarily valued for reproductive potential and alliance creation. Boys were groomed for leadership and heirs. Education, grooming, and duties were tailored to ensure their value as instruments of the state. Play, spontaneity, and self-expression were rare luxuries. Childhoods were sacrificed on the altar of dynastic survival. Even in modern reinterpretations, this history challenges romanticized notions of royal life. Palaces, crowns, and ceremonies obscure the reality. Young individuals coerced into unions, robbed of autonomy, and burdened by responsibilities they did not choose. The stories of princes and princesses are inseparable from political strategy and familial expectation, revealing that behind the glitter, life was often a negotiation of duty and loss. Cultural norms perpetuated the practice. Across continents, the sanctity of lineage, political alliances, and dynastic continuity trumped personal freedom. Royal households enforced obedience, often punishing defiance, emphasizing that individual desires were subordinate to statecraft. Emotional repression was institutionalized, shaping generations of royals conditioned to sacrifice selfhood for dynastic advantage. From Europe to Asia, Africa to the Middle East, the patterns were strikingly similar. Child marriages among royalty were less about intimacy and more about strategy, inheritance, and politics. Across centuries, these practices reinforced power hierarchies while eroding the childhoods of countless boys and girls. Though chronicle records often celebrate the pageantry, they rarely convey the inner suffering, fear, and confusion endured by those who lived it. In some cases, these marriages yielded strong alliances, stabilized empires, or secured dynasties. But for the children involved, the costs were lasting: lost innocence, psychological scars, premature responsibilities, and sometimes physical harm or death. Even those who later became celebrated leaders carried the burden of childhoods curtailed by political necessity. The untold story of child marriages among royals exposes a harsh truth. Opulence often came at the price of freedom. Behind every jewel-encrusted crown and majestic palace lay the reality of youth sacrificed for power. The history of these marriages challenges the idyllic image of royalty, revealing a world where the innocent were bound by obligation, and childhood itself became an instrument of the state. By examining these historical practices, we not only understand the mechanics of political strategy, but also glimpse the human cost behind decisions made for power and prestige. Royalty's legacy is thus intertwined with both triumph and tragedy, demonstrating that behind grandeur often lurked coercion and the loss of self. Child marriages among royals were a global phenomenon, motivated by politics, tradition, and the pursuit of power. They illustrate the tension between personal desire and public duty, freedom and obligation. While history celebrates the opulence of royal courts, it often hides the silent suffering of the youngest generation, whose lives were shaped by crowns before they could even comprehend them. Understanding this history forces us to reconsider notions of privilege, childhood, and the sacrifices made in the pursuit of dynasty. Imagine being born into unimaginable luxury, yet trapped in a gilded cage, where every step is dictated by politics rather than personal choice. Across centuries, royal courts masked a grim reality behind glittering crowns and grand ceremonies. The practice of marrying children and adolescents for power, influence, and dynastic survival. Young princes and princesses were forced into unions before they could understand love, intimacy, or even consent. While history celebrates royalty's opulence, it rarely reveals the suffering, fear, and psychological scars endured by those whose childhoods were traded for dynastic ambition. If the hidden realities of royal life fascinate you, read on. Comment your thoughts, share this story, and subscribe to uncover more historical truths where crowns gleamed, yet childhoods were stolen, and innocence was surrendered to the demands of power. By the 13th and 14th centuries, child and adolescent marriages among royals had become entrenched across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Dynastic alliances dictated lives before children could comprehend their consequences. Royal girls as young as 7 or 8 were pledged to foreign courts, sent away from parents and familiar surroundings, and thrust into roles demanding decorum, diplomacy, and obedience far beyond their years. Young boys were similarly trained, expected to produce heirs, master political strategy, and embody the authority of their lineage while still navigating the turbulent threshold of adolescence. In Europe, Blanche of Castile's early life exemplifies this reality. Betrothed at age 12 to Louis VIII of France, Blanche faced immense pressure to master court etiquette, political negotiation, and religious observance. Her value as a young royal was measured not by intellect or personal desires, but by her ability to secure the continuity of dynastic power. In the Byzantine Empire, princesses were frequently promised in infancy, formalizing alliances between states before cohabitation or consummation occurred. Yet the psychological weight of these commitments loomed over their entire childhoods. In the Mughal courts of India, imperial princesses and princes were similarly constrained. Education encompassed multiple languages, political and religious instruction, and cultural refinement, all designed to maximize their dynastic worth. Personal choice was virtually non-existent. The looming reality of early marriage instilled a constant awareness of obligation, leaving little room for exploration, play, or emotional development. Royal children learned to internalize obedience, often masking fear, anxiety, and confusion with poise and grace. Physical risks amplified the pressure. Adolescent girls who bore children faced significant health dangers, including high mortality rates, while young boys bore the burden of producing heirs. The psychological strain was compounded by the isolation imposed by strict court hierarchies. Diaries, letters, and sporadic chroniclers' accounts suggest that many young royals suffered quietly, navigating trauma while fulfilling ceremonial roles and dynastic duties. Gender dictated different expectations. Girls were primarily valued for their reproductive potential and ability to cement alliances, while boys were groomed for kingship, inheritance, and military leadership. Daily routines, educational priorities, and social interactions were strictly structured. Play, curiosity, and emotional exploration were sacrificed for political expediency. Defiance was rare and often punished by isolation or strict supervision. Mary Tudor of England provides another stark illustration. Betrothed as a child, Mary's youth was consumed by rigorous education, religious instruction, and preparation for international alliances. Her later reign, though celebrated, bore traces of a childhood dominated by duty, control, and curtailed personal freedom, a pattern common among European royalty of her era. Similarly, Rajput princesses in India were pledged in early adolescence to secure strategic alliances, navigating strict codes of honor and familial expectation while confronting emotional and physical demands beyond their years. Across the Middle East, Ottoman princesses and princes experienced comparable constraints. Marriages arranged in childhood symbolized political commitment. While consummation might be postponed until puberty, the psychological and social weight of early commitment shaped their identities and expectations. Boys were similarly bound to dynastic service, and their personal agency was secondary to political expedience. Even in African royal systems, adolescent marriages were common to consolidate tribal unity or political stability. These unions, though culturally accepted, mirrored patterns seen globally. Political gain was prioritized over individual choice. Childhood autonomy was limited, and emotional development often sacrificed for loyalty to family and state. Long-term impacts were profound. Many former child brides and grooms struggled with intimacy and trust in adulthood. Marriages forged under obligation rather than affection frequently led to estrangement or dependency on advisors. Early trauma influenced governance, leadership style, and familial relations across generations. Chronic stress, repression, and premature responsibility shaped entire reigns, sometimes resulting in rigid authority, isolation, or psychological fragility. Psychological effects often remained invisible to outsiders. Young royals mastered public decorum and ceremonial roles, hiding fear, grief, or rebellion behind polished appearances. Chronicles rarely capture these private struggles, though occasional letters and memoirs hint at isolation, melancholy, or silent resistance. These glimpses suggest the profound human cost hidden beneath the splendor of palace life. As dynastic politics evolved, some regions recognized the biological and emotional limits of child marriage, delaying consummation and cohabitation. Nevertheless, the practice persisted for centuries, reinforcing power hierarchies, gender roles, and societal expectations, and maintaining the perception that loyalty to family and state must override personal autonomy. The examination of these practices deepens understanding of the intersection between culture, politics, and human cost. Royalty may have wielded wealth and influence, yet children born into these families often endured invisible constraints, their formative years governed by dynastic strategy rather than personal development. Child and adolescent marriages among royals highlight the persistent tension between agency and obligation, personal desire, and political necessity. These unions challenge romanticized narratives of courtly life, revealing a reality where youth was curtailed, freedom restricted, and childhood sacrificed for the perpetuation of power. Across continents and centuries, this pattern reflects a global phenomenon, the strategic exploitation of children to secure dynastic survival. Understanding this hidden history underscores both the resilience of those who endured it and the ethical costs of subordinating human well-being to political expediency. Behind every crown and palace lay stories of lost childhood, silent endurance, and the relentless weight of expectation, a stark reminder that privilege does not always guarantee freedom, and opulence often conceals hardship. The legacy of these marriages continues to resonate, offering insight into the complexities of power, duty, and human experience in royal life. By acknowledging the unseen struggles behind celebrated dynasties, we honor the memory of those whose childhoods were claimed in the name of politics and power, and we gain a fuller understanding of the true cost of royal ambition. When we look at the gilded portraits of kings and queens hanging in museums or the polished dramas about royal courts, it is tempting to see their lives as filled with luxury, power, and choice. Yet hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains of palaces lies a truth that is rarely spoken. Many of those who wore crowns as adults had their lives decided for them when they were still children. The practice of child and adolescent marriages among royals was not a rare accident of history, but a recurring tradition that spanned continents and centuries. These were not fairy tale weddings blessed by romance. They were contracts, tools of diplomacy, and weapons of survival for empires. For the children themselves, it meant a life stolen, reshaped, and repurposed for dynastic ambition before they had the chance to dream for themselves. As you read this story, I invite you to look past the grandeur of palaces and thrones, and instead see the fragile hearts of children forced into roles they could not escape. Imagine an 8-year-old bride standing stiffly before courtiers, or a 12-year-old prince burdened with the knowledge that his marriage secured an empire's peace. These are not just names in history books. They were once real children with laughter, fears, and unspoken longings. Stay with me through this journey into royal history, because understanding these hidden sacrifices is the only way we can grasp the human cost of power and the darkness beneath the crown. From the earliest dynasties, marriage was never merely a personal choice for royals, it was a state strategy. The notion of romance or companionship was a luxury seldom allowed. Instead, marriages were carefully arranged treaties meant to secure land, forge alliances, or prevent wars. For this reason, children became the most valuable currency in the royal marketplace. Their bodies were not yet mature, but their bloodlines were considered pure gold. Dynasties clung to them like precious treasures, bargaining their futures before they could even walk. In medieval Europe, this practice was not only normalized but celebrated as wisdom. A child's marriage could unite kingdoms and prevent generations of bloodshed. Yet from the perspective of the child, it meant being uprooted from familiar surroundings and forced into a new life with strangers. Isabella of Valois is one of the most striking examples. Married to England's King Richard II at the tender age of 7, she was paraded in public as queen consort. Though the marriage was not consummated, she bore the responsibilities of representing a kingdom and living in a court far from her family. At an age when most children would be learning to read or chasing friends in the garden, Isabella was dressed in royal robes, bowing to foreign nobles, and learning to hide her tears behind ceremony. Her story was far from unique. Eleanor of Castile, who married the future King Edward I of England, was only around 13 when she was wedded to a man who was already 15. Their marriage was intended to strengthen ties between Castile and England, not to honor their personal choices. Similarly, Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, was married at the age of 12 and gave birth at 13, nearly dying from the trauma of childbirth. Her survival was considered miraculous, but her youth was sacrificed for dynastic ambition. These examples underscore a painful truth. Royal children were not cherished for their innocence, but exploited for their potential to cement power. The Habsburg dynasty in particular institutionalized these practices, marrying off children within their own bloodline to preserve power. From adolescence, cousins were wedded to cousins, sometimes even uncles to nieces, in order to keep land and titles within the family. This obsessive control of bloodlines created generations of children whose futures were predetermined before they were born. By the time they were toddlers, negotiations for their betrothals were already underway. Some marriages were agreed upon while the children were still infants. By the time they grew old enough to understand, their identities had already been erased by duty. The physical consequences of this relentless intermarriage became visible in deformities like the Habsburg jaw. But the emotional consequences, the childhood sacrificed and the voices silenced, were far less visible yet equally devastating. Child marriages were not confined to Europe. In South Asia, the Mughal Empire and its contemporaries often used early marriages to form alliances. Mughal emperors frequently betrothed their children to powerful Rajput clans or Persian elites, intertwining politics with family at the expense of the children involved. The Mughal princess Jahanara, though spared marriage herself due to her father Shah Jahan's unusual decision, grew up watching her siblings and cousins exchanged in these political bargains. A young Mughal princess, often only 12 or 13, might find herself moved to a distant fortress, separated from her family, and married to a man decades older. While some royal women in the Mughal court did gain influence later in life, in their childhood years they endured an existence defined by submission and duty. In the Middle East, the Ottoman practice was slightly different, but equally constraining. Ottoman princesses were often married in their teenage years to loyal pashas or governors. Their marriages were less about uniting kingdoms than ensuring loyalty to the sultan's household. These marriages uprooted young women from Istanbul and sent them to distant provinces, where they were both symbols of the sultan's favor and prisoners of their circumstances. Though their husbands benefited from the prestige of marrying into the dynasty, the princesses were expected to give up any claim to personal autonomy. They were royal pawns disguised as wives, their value tied not to their choices, but to their ability to stabilize the empire's control. The psychological consequences of these marriages cannot be underestimated. Modern psychology emphasizes the importance of adolescence as a time for self-discovery and independence. But royal adolescents were denied this stage entirely. They were thrust into adult roles long before they had the chance to develop their own identities. A young girl in such a position learned quickly to suppress her feelings, to present a mask of composure even when terrified or homesick. A young boy learned to carry the expectations of entire nations before he had even tasted freedom. Their playtime was replaced by lessons in diplomacy, languages, and courtly etiquette, and their friendships were replaced by political advisors and suspicious courtiers. Religious institutions often reinforced these practices. In Catholic Europe, the Church sanctified child marriages if they served dynastic interests. In Islamic empires, religious scholars legitimized marriages as a means of securing alliances, though often with restrictions on consummation until puberty. Despite differences in theology, the underlying reality remained the same. The child's welfare was secondary to the state's ambition. The voice of the child was almost never heard, drowned out by the voices of kings, priests, and advisors who argued over strategy, while the bride or groom remained silent in the background. The saddest element of these unions is the erasure of individuality. Children who were married off for politics rarely left personal accounts because their voices were suppressed. Their identities became consumed by the dynasties they served. They were renamed, relocated, and redefined by the needs of power. Many were forced to abandon their native languages and religions, assimilating into the court of their spouse. In essence, they ceased to exist as children and were reborn as living symbols of treaties. But even within this web of oppression, there are glimpses of resilience. Some royal children grew into strong figures who shaped history, despite their beginnings. Catherine de' Medici, married at 14 to the future King Henry II of France, endured a childhood defined by politics, but later became one of the most powerful queens in European history. Similarly, Isabella of Castile was married at 18, older than many of her contemporaries, but she had grown up surrounded by examples of forced marriages and used her position to assert independence, reshaping Spain's destiny alongside Ferdinand. These stories show that while child marriage often silenced children, some managed to turn their captivity into opportunity for influence. Still, we cannot romanticize these exceptions. For every Catherine or Isabella, there were countless others who lived and died without recognition, their stories swallowed by dynastic ambition. Their names appear only briefly in genealogies or treaties, remembered as the daughter of or the wife of, never as themselves. They became invisible, absorbed into the machinery of history. The legacy of child and adolescent marriages among royals remains visible today, not only in the genetic traces left by dynasties like the Habsburgs, but also in the historical memory of entire nations. The wars avoided, the treaties signed, and the kingdoms united often came at the price of a child's lost future. When we admire the grandeur of castles or the lineage of monarchs, we must also remember the invisible children whose lives were bartered to build them. To truly understand royal history, we must acknowledge this darker dimension. The power of kings and queens was not only built on military might or economic wealth, but also on the fragile shoulders of children forced into marriages they could not comprehend. Their silence is the foundation beneath the crown, their tears the unseen ink that sealed treaties. When history books recount the triumphs of dynasties, they rarely pause to ask, what did it mean for a child of 7 to be queen, or a boy of 12 to be husband? What dreams were crushed? What fears were hidden? What lives were lost in the name of stability? These are questions worth asking, for they remind us that the story of royalty is not only a story of power, but also of sacrifice, suffering, and stolen youth. In remembering them, we see history not only as the story of rulers and empires, but as the story of children who never got to be children. And in honoring their memory, we learn to question the very foundations of power and tradition. Because beneath every crown lies a child who once longed for freedom,